Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to Medieval Church History. I'm Teresa Holman, and with me is Father Michael Witt. Welcome, Father.
Thank you, Teresa.
We've had a little interim in recording, and so it's so good to be back. I was thinking as I was driving in today, it would be so good to sit back in this chair with you and listen to more wonderful history programs that you present for us.
Well, especially since this is the turning point. Things start getting better after this. We've
That's
been through
good.
some pretty rough times.
It was kind of ugly for a while there,
Yes,
wasn't it?
yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
So where are we going today, Father?
Well, today we're going to take a look at the monasteries. And we're going to see how, again, feudalism was detrimental to the monasteries. One in particular I found to be a fascinating study, the monastery at Farfa in Italy. And we'll take a look at that. And we're going to take a look at one tiny little monastery in the Jura Mountains, southern France, between France and Switzerland, and how this little tiny monastery begins the whole Reformation of the Church.
Wow.
It's a neat story.
Wonderful.
So
Sounds like a good turn.
yes, it is. And then from there, it's not going to be easy. You know, the Reformation that takes place and is going to be tough. There are going to be victims through this, but there's a vision and a reestablishment, and it's the fight goes. The fight goes on. Well, we've already seen that there was this tremendous stress that Europe was under social chaos of huge and century-long attacks by the Muslims in the south and the west, by the Magyars coming in from the east, by the Vikings coming in from the north, and this tremendous chaos. And as a result, Europe comes up with its own solution. It speaks for itself by establishing feudalism. And feudalism works fine as far as the military and the social order, but the problem is that the stress of feudalism is going to have a devastating effect on parishes. We've seen before, remember that that the local lords and vassals are going to build the little tiny churches in the villages. They're going to supply the priests, and the priests are going to have no education at all. These are mass priests, and as a result, this holy clergy that you had from the time of the early church just disintegrates on that local level. Bishops are not able to do anything to help because they themselves are beholding. They're stuck in their diocesan sees. They're not able to hardly ever get out safely to get out, and many of them are also beholding to other local lords to bring law and order to those regions, and many of them are the relatives of these lords, and so you can't turn to bishops. And in many cases, these bishops then become bishops because of simony. They're literally, their families are buying those positions. And we've even seen the Roman pontiff. The office itself of the pontificate is under the control of certain Roman families, and they use whatever means they want or have at their disposal in order to put their own family members onto the throne of Peter. And we've seen a couple already, popes that obviously don't come up to muster.
Right.
Well, then what about the monasteries? Well, remember back there was that monastery in the westernmost part of France called the Noirmoutier. And remember how they'd been attacked by the Vikings year after year after year. Finally, the monks said, that's it, we're out of here. They moved. They got attacked again, got attacked. They had to move 5 times. Monasteries aren't supposed to be, caravans of RVs.
Right.
And there they have 5 times before they finally found a place that even the Vikings wouldn't want to go to. And there they set themselves up. Most of the Celtic monasteries, the Irish monasteries, and Irish monasticism is a great gift to the church. Most of them have been destroyed. Their wonderful libraries had been destroyed, burned. On the continent, many of them survive, but they're severely damaged. They're reduced in the number of monks, and monastic discipline is also reduced. A lot of this depends upon the individual abbot. Monastery, even to this day, monasteries and houses of religious houses are very much influenced by the local superior. And so it was also at the medieval monasteries, and most of these abbots were appointed by the local lord. So it's going to be whoever this count or baron or whatever is going to pick a monk and say you'll be the abbot of this monastery. The monks don't have much influence in deciding who that's going to be, and because many of the monasteries were built by the families of these lords, there you have that whole Frankish thing again. If I built it, it's mine. And of course, remember that the lords themselves are most concerned, especially at the beginning, most concerned about using every piece of asset that they have in order to bring protection to their area. And so there is no luxury. Everything has to be maximized, and that's true of the monasteries too. So the monasteries become houses of, or engines, I guess you could say, engines of producing grain, of cattle, vegetables, herbs, fruits, huge orchards, vineyards, and these become real production areas and regions of production. And most of that, because of the setup of the monastery, most of that is then available for the people of the area through that local lord. He'll oversee that. So the abbot, it's very important that whoever that lord is, that count, that baron, whatever, is going to have an abbot that they can rely on. And in many cases, it's going to be a relative, or it's going to be some toady who's going to do whatever they say. And that's all over Europe. Now, as I say, I was going through reading about this in general terms, but while I was doing it, I came across a particular monastery that was spoken about in the Cambridge history of medieval Europe. They're one of their volumes, and it's the monastery of Farfa. It's Farfa. And interestingly enough, that monastery is alive and well today.
Oh, really?
And not only that, they also have a really good webmaster. And and I thought to myself, why not Google it? And I did. And sure enough, there's a wonderful website. And all you have to do is just Google that, and they've got the whole history. They tell you the whole history of the Abbey of Farfa, and it's a sad history, but it's also a history of hope. And so here's what happened. It had been a magnificent monastery. It was visited by many people, including emperors. Holy Roman emperors, while visiting Italy, would stay at Farfa and give wonderful gifts. And the monks were known for their holiness and their goodness, and everything just seemed to be wonderful. And then in 915, it was attacked by a group of Saracens. These are Muslim raiders. And obviously the monks couldn't defend themselves, and many of them were killed or wounded. The Saracens went through and stole whatever they wanted to. And then after that, a couple years later, there was a group of Christian bandits. These are, bandits that just happened to be, they weren't Muslim, they were Christians, and they attacked. And they did the same thing to the monks that the Saracens had done. And there was no defense. There was nobody there to be able to defend them. And once again, here's a situation where you need to have some local law and order. Mm-hmm. And there's no 911 you can turn to. And what happened was the abbot realized that they were susceptible, that the word had gotten out, that if you want riches, you can go and you can go to Farfa and do whatever you want. And so he took the monks and he sent them off, some to Rome, some to Rieti, and son to Fermo. And the abbot himself went to Rome. But while he was there, he was poisoned. Mm. And we don't know the circumstances of how he came to be murdered, but we know that he was. In fact, at this time, around in the 900s, it was a very dangerous thing to be an abbot of a monastery. There's another case of an abbot, Erlewin of Lobez, who was attacked in 909 by two farmer monks that he had kicked out of the monastery for being bad monks.
Oh my gosh.
And he was on a trip when those two got together, and they jumped him, and they beat him up, and then they gouged his eyes out and cut out his tongue.
Oh my gosh.
I'm telling you, this is dangerous back then. And so here you have the monks of Farfa spread out all over Italy, and their own abbot now has been murdered. And now you have a lord who looks at Farfa and goes, "Whoa, this is a pretty good piece of real estate." And his name is King Hugh. He's the king of Italy, and he decided that the grounds would be good enough to build a fortress. And so he turns the monastery into a fortress. And then he appoints one of the monks, a man by the name of Raffred, Brother Raffred, Fra Raffred, as the abbot. So here you have a lord appointing an abbot, and he tells Brother Raffred to go back to Farfa and to rebuild the monastery there, but as a fortress, and that he would gather some of the monks together, but not all of them. He would choose which monks he would bring back, and they would settle 100 families around the monastery in order to encourage agriculture in the area. Okay, so some of these monks are brought back, but Brother Raffred chooses only certain monks in order to do this, and these are guys who are good at building. So to build up the walls as fortifications, they understand masonry, and then these are guys who are good at farming in order to get the orchards back, and in fact the area is known for its olive orchards, and to get those things going up again. The whole idea is to produce revenue. That's all. It is not for prayer. And so the monks who are holy are not invited back. The Farfa then is dominated by these little worker monks. One of the areas that they were most concerned about was the study of apothecary and herbalism. And so in the gardens themselves, they're going to be growing various kinds of herbs. And we're not talking about culinary herbs here,
right.
A little basil for cooking.
Pharmaceutical.
These are pharmaceuticals, but particularly they're interested in poisonous herbs.
Oh, okay, maybe not pharmaceutical.
Well, yeah.
In a different sort.
In a different sort, yeah. And so the idea is that this monastery, besides producing fruits and olives and olive oil and all these sorts of things, is also producing poisonous herbs to be used for, well, you guess, we're not talking about rat poison here, In fact, a number of these abbots, including Brother Raffred himself, end up becoming victims of their own herbalism. And there's a whole series then of abbots who are poisoned by their monks. And mainly because these guys, these abbots, are beholding to the king, and he wants production. And as they push these monks harder and harder, and I use the word monk, but for all practical purposes, they weren't. I mean, they didn't pray.
They were laborers for
they were laborers. Yeah, and so they turn around and they kill off abbot after abbot, and until it gets to the point in which basically this monastery is turned into nothing more than a commune of workers. They have absolutely no motivation, and as a result, they have no sense of vows, and so they bring women in and begin setting up their own concubines.
Oh my gosh!
What can I say?
Well, if you're not praying.
No, they're not. And at one point, they finally decided that it was a waste to even have Mass on Sunday, and so they even did away with Mass on Sunday, and the people in the village had to go find a Mass someplace else.
Wow.
So this is a non-functioning monastery for all practical purposes. Then what happens is King Hugh turns around, gives this piece of property to one of his vassals as a fief. Remember that relationship between the lord and the vassal and the fief. And when that happens, and King Hugh is no longer involved in the daily affairs, some of the monks of the old monastery think, here's an opportunity, we're going to come back and we're going to clean this place up. And they went back to Farfa, and they were then expelled, kicked out. One attempt after another there was in trying to reform the monastery at Farfa, and time after time the monks were either beaten up or they were poisoned, and this ended up going on for quite a period of time. Lots of failures, lots of poisonings, and this is the same story all over Europe. This is not just in Italy, not just in Farfa, but all over Europe. Monastery after monastery is experiencing this kind of degradation. The happy news is that ultimately it's cleaned up. A lot of this has, I'm jumping a bit, but a lot of this has to do with this holy monastery of Cluny, and the impression that the Cluniac monks had on local lords, who then turned around and said, we want our monasteries to be like this too. And then and read in the story of Farfa itself, and you'll see that eventually good triumphs over evil. The evil poisoning monks are eventually sent away, and then the monastery is restored. And as I say, it is a functioning monastery to this day.
Wonderful.
Yeah. All over the place you're going to have then the state of affairs in which there are men and women. Remember that there are monasteries that are established also for women who have set their lives. Remember that many of these men and women came to these monasteries, to these convents, because they were religiously motivated.
Right.
You know, we tend to forget that when we start looking at all the horrors that are happening. And they've set themselves aside to live a life that in the church is known as the veri religiosi, you know, the man of religion, the person of religion, and they set themselves alive to live an absolute lifelong practice of Christian faith in a very radical kind of a way, and away from the cares and woes and temptations of the world. And they do this under a rule and under the charism of a founder. And now they find themselves in these monasteries that are being controlled by another controlling element, which is going to be the endowments and the intentions of the donors and the outlook of laity, for the most part, often relatives. And so there has to be this sense on the part of many of them of just almost despair, you know, to see their lives like that. And what was so fascinating is that in the moment when hope seemed hopelessly far away, there was a monastery which was not known for its holiness, which had been at one time. This was the monastery of St. Martin. It's in Tours. Now remember the Battle of Tours. Remember the Muslims were trying to come up and destroy that monastery, and Charles Martel had protected it and all. But there was this monastery there in Tours in which somebody said, you know, we got some books here. We ought to read these books. And they pulled out the rule of St. Benedict. And some of the monks read it. You know, they still had reading during meals. And in the refectory they read this. And most of them were just, you know, eating and drinking and not paying much attention. But there were two guys. There were two monks that listened, and they got together and they said to themselves, we're supposedly living a Benedictine life, and here's the rule of St. Benedict, and we're not following it. We ought to follow it. And they made suggestions to the other monks to do the same, and the other monks said, don't bother us. Remember John of the Cross?
Yeah.
Okay. And that's centuries later.
Right.
Centuries later.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
But here you had the same thing. And these two brothers, one's name was Odo.
Odo.
Okay. And the other was Adhirjan.
Okay.
I guess you pronounce it like Adhirjan or something like that. Anyway, the two of them finally became so disgusted with the life at this monastery that they both left. And they traveled all throughout France looking for a monastery of St. Benedict that actually followed the Benedictine rule. And they couldn't find one. No, none of them, you know. And finally, Brother Odo simply gave up. And Adhirjan said, "Oh, don't give up, don't give up." And he says, "No, I've had it. There is no monastery like this. I'm going to go off and live a hermit's life." And so he went and he built a little tiny cabin someplace and began living the life of St. Benedict, the rule of St. Benedict, on his own. And Adhirjan would not give up. And he kept on traveling and traveling. As I say, he got down into southern France, and there's a mountain range there along the Swiss border called the Jura Mountains. And it's a pretty rugged area. And there he came across a little tiny monastery at Beaume. This was in 909 A.D.
Okay.
And at Beaume, there was a little monastery, just a dozen or so brothers. But the abbot there actually used the rule of St. Benedict as the rule for that house. And all the brothers agreed with that. And his name was Abbot Bernot. And Adhirjan joined that monastery. But he also sent word to Brother Odo.
Uh-huh.
I found it. I found it. And Brother Odo left his little hermitage and came down, and he joined the monastery too. Well, there they were, happy as two little peas in a pod, you know, and everything was just wonderful for 1 year.
Uh-oh.
And the next year, Abbot Bernot was asked to meet with one of the most powerful lords in that area, Duke William of Aquitaine.
Oh.
And Duke William met with Brother Bernot, Abbot Bernot, and said, "I have no children, I have no heirs, and I have lived a very violent life. I need repentance. I need to do something. Before I meet God, I need to be able to say, I did something good in my life." And he said, "You can be the conduit for that. I have a hunting lodge, which is just really, really neat, and I'll give it to you and the brothers. And you can move there. It'll be your monastery." And Brother Bernot said, "No strings attached. We're not going to do one of these Frankish things. Mm-hmm. If you give it to me, it's mine. You don't have anything to say about it." And Duke William said, "It's yours." And with that, the brothers then set up a second house. They still kept Beaume as a little monastery, but then they set up their second house, and this becomes the monastery of Cluny. And Abbot Bernot, in order to keep independent not only of Duke William, but also Duke William's toady, the bishop of the area, he swore allegiance to only one, and that was to the Pope. And so Cluny then is established again according to the rule of St. Benedict. Word gets around that this is a holy place with holy men, and before you know it, it begins attracting more and more. Many of these monks from monasteries who, like those two brothers, were living in these monasteries just longing for something greater than that, mm-hmm. looking for some kind of spiritual consolation. And so they found it then at Cluny. So much so that within 10 years, Cluny outgrew itself, and they had to establish 3 other monasteries.
Wow.
Every abbey they established was with the same provision, that it was independent of that local lord, that they were beholden to nobody but themselves and the Pope. And these are all in the region of Berry in central France. In 931, you have a pope in Rome, Pope John the 11th, who is not a terribly good pope by any means. But what he did was he sent word all throughout the church in Europe that that any monk in monasteries that was unhappy with the kind of non-observance and would be willing to go or wanting to go to a Cluniac monastery would be relieved of their vows. It was an open invitation.
Wow.
It was an indult to all the vows so that these monks then would be free, because a lot of them were not freed.
Right.
You know, I mean, you'd have a monk that maybe is a pretty good, I don't know, vintner or something, or a mason or whatever, and he turns around and he says, well, Abbot, I want to go to this monastery with, you know, I can pray. And the abbot says, no, you're under vows. Mm-hmm. Well, now, it's probably the only thing that Pope John did good in his life. But one of the things he did was he allowed then the monks to come to from all over Europe to go to a Cluniac monastery. And one other thing he did too was when Abbot Berno died, he had a nephew who wanted to take control of the monastery at Bohm. In fact, actually did. And Pope John sent word to him and said, no, you cannot do that. Give that back over to the monks. And so he backed down on that. Once again, it's one of the few good things that he did. Abbot Berno's successor was Brother Odo.
Oh, okay.
You know, the
hermit.
The hermit.
Transplant.
Yeah, that's right. And so he comes in and then he continues the growth of the monastery. Obviously, is going to be keeping the rule of Saint Benedict and helping to instill that into the other monks. In the meantime, things deteriorate in Rome again. Pope John was, for what little he did, despite his one or two good deeds, he was attacked by the Duke of Tuscany, and he had to watch before his very eyes the murder of his brother. And then he himself was thrown into prison and languished in prison for the rest. You know, he didn't live very much longer. His successor was another one of these Theophylactate creations. Marozia had placed her own son on the throne of Peter. He's 25 years old, and he basically did everything she wanted until finally the two of them were thrown into prison, and by his own brother, her own son, and wow. There they remained until 935. The next pope to be elected or placed on the throne really is Leo the Seventh. And at least he had enough sense that he needed a spiritual advisor. And so he sent to Abbot Odo of Cluny to come to Rome and to give him advice. Well, Abbot Odo did. He traveled down to Rome, and while he was there, he just impressed the heck out of everybody, because they had never seen a holy man before.
Oh my gosh.
It's pretty sad, isn't it? And one of those who was really impressed was the Patricius of Rome, sort of like the prefect of Rome. His name was Alberic II. He is by no means a holy man himself. You know, he's done some really bad things in his life, but he knows holiness when he sees it. And he realizes that this is what has to be done. And so what he does is he then uses his own power as a lord to begin going into these monasteries, many of which had been totally abandoned because of the Saracen raids. And he begins to reestablish these monasteries and bring in good monks and use the model of Cluny in these monasteries themselves. And so little by little, the Reformation of monasticism in Italy begins to spread as a result of the impression that Abbot Odo had made when he went to Rome to give spiritual advice to Pope Leo. In fact, Farfa itself was reformed in 997 when the murdering monks were all sent away, and a young monk by the name of Ugo became abbot, was named abbot, and then he brought in some good monks, and so the story of Farfa continues on. Abbot Odo, and he is canonized. It's Saint Odo
really?
of Cluny. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And he died in 942. His successor, elected by the monks at Cluny, went blind almost immediately after his succession. And he realized that being blind, he was not going to be able to be up to the task of doing what needs to be done. These were dangerous times, and you needed the very best. And so he then chose one of the brothers, Msgr, as abbot. He also becomes, he also is canonized.
Oh my gosh.
Saint Msgr. The next five, by then you've got five Cluny abbots, monasteries in France. Others are also modeled after the Cluniac monasteries. You've got, so in other words, the Cluniac reforms spread out of France into Belgium. Monasteries in Normandy are changed. In Spain, Montserrat is established near Barcelona, specifically on that same idea. And the whole concept of the Cluniac monastery was to spend more time at prayer and at public worship than what the typical Benedictines had done. So they actually took, that ora et labora concept, and they emphasized the ora, the prayer, even over the labor. So that becomes even more important liturgical.
From where they had come, you would see the need for that.
Yeah.
Because in the time where they had gone to work more and not prayer, then maybe they needed to shift for a little more prayer than work for a while until.
And that's where you're going to see, that's where you can go to, if you went to a monastery, a Benedictine monastery, and you saw immediately what their schedule was, you could tell whether or not they were influenced by the Cluniacs or not. And monastery after monastery, more and more of them are coming under that concept. And here's the whole irony of this. This is at the very same time as this monastic reform is underway. This is the very same time when you get the lowest of the low in the papacy, when Octavian becomes pope and takes the name John the 12th, totally dominated by the Theophylactate family. Now, what happens is that at this point, you have a coming together of a weaving of relationships between these reforming monks at Cluny, and particularly a group of very powerful, important lay people in Germany. These are the kings and emperors of the German Empire, Holy Roman emperors. And the key between bringing together the reforming minds of the Holy Roman Empire and the reformed monks at Cluny is a young girl. It all comes down to one young girl, and she's the daughter of Rudolph II of Burgundy, who was also king of Italy at the time. That's sort of a title. It really doesn't have much power to it, but it's a title. And her name is Adelaide. She's a little Burgundian girl. And Adelaide is married off to the successor as king of Italy, a man by the name of Lothar. Okay? And everything seems to be fine. She's going to be a lovely little queen and everything. She's personally lives a devout life, and then everything goes sour. I mean, this thing is like one of these fairy tales where you get the evil, it looks like it's going to win out. Her husband Lothar is poisoned, and the one who does it is a political rival of his, man by the name of Berengar of Ivrea. He then tries to force Adelaide to marry his evil son.
Okay.
She refuses. She's then thrown into a prison. And her personal holiness in that prison so impresses the guards that they look the other way, and she escapes.
Oh, wow.
And she escapes to a castle up in northern Italy, a little hideaway called Canossa. And while she's there, then, of course, the evil Berengar and his son, they begin to go after her. And she's saved by a handsome young German prince by the name of Otto. And so he saves her, this poor little widow. And, she's just a young woman herself at this point. And in the process, they fall in love with each other. And they marry. And Otto eventually goes back to Germany with her, brings Queen Adelaide with her. And they have 4 sons. And these are Henry, Bruno, Matilda. I'm sorry, 3 sons and a daughter. Henry, Bruno, Matilda, and little baby Otto. Okay? He becomes the Emperor Otto the First. And we'll talk a little bit more about him later on. But anyway, he first of all, becomes Emperor Otto the First, and then he dies. And then his youngest son, Otto Jr., becomes king in Germany. Okay. And of course, he's just a little boy. So Adelaide, this Burgundian princess who is made Queen of Italy, whose husband is then murdered, who then hides in Canossa, who is then saved by Otto the First, who is brought to Germany. Now she becomes the regent over Germany for her little son Otto the Second. She is absolutely beloved in Germany.
Wow. The
people of Germany absolutely love her, and then ultimately her son is married, and there's this alliance that is made between the Kingdom of Germany on the one side and the Byzantine Empire on the other. And so the Byzantines then send a princess to marry Adelaide's son. Okay, her name is Theophana, and Theophana arrives, married off to the son, who is now comes into his majority, becomes king, Otto the Second, and all. And Theophana hates her mother-in-law.
Oh no!
And she succeeds in turning little young Otto against his own mother, and so she's sent away. And and everybody in Germany is just really upset about this because she's such a wonderful woman. She goes to Cluny, and she basically lives at Cluny as a nun. It doesn't take vows, but she lives a very simple right. She becomes a dear friend of the abbot there. His name is Abbot Majorlus, and he uses his good offices to reconcile mother and son back together again.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And the reconciliation takes place. Otto the Second dies. Adelaide is brought back to Germany before Otto the Second dies. But when he dies, they have a son.
With the girl,
Theophano and Otto the Second, and little baby Otto. This is another Otto. And the question is, who's going to be the regent? And the regency, unfortunately, goes to Theophana, the mother.
Oh my gosh.
And she's back again, and again she turns around and exiles Adelaide out of Germany. And it looks like it's going to be the end of the story, but Theophana dies.
No.
Now, Adelaide, if she has nothing else besides holiness, she also has staying power.
She does.
And she's brought back to Germany again, this time to raise her grandson, little Otto III. And she remains, at the time, she remains close not only to the German court, but also close to the monks at Cluny. That's why I say Adelaide is very important to this story, because she's the one who's going to bring together the reforming monks of Cluny with the people who can do the reform, the emperors in Germany.
Uh-huh.
And now a new abbot now is in Cluny. This is Abbot Odilo, who is also canonized, Saint
Oh my
Odilo.
gosh.
I mean, they're really producing some saints.
Definitely.
And not only that, again, they have staying power. This guy is abbot from 994 to 1049.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, he's abbot for over 50 years.
Long time.
And he has incredible influence, just like Abbot Odo, St. Odo had. Again now, St. Odilo has incredible influence on religious life and monasteries way beyond his own monastery. And one of the things he does in order to make sure that there's no backsliding is that, unlike typical Benedictine monasteries, which stand independent one from another, these monasteries, all the daughter monasteries of Cluny, are tied together to Cluny. And St. Odilo makes visitations to each of these monasteries, doing this on at least an annual basis. And he brings all of the abbots of these other monasteries together at least once a year for a chapter that would take place at Cluny itself to make sure that everything is going as it should be. Eventually he'll die at the age of 87. And 55 years of service.
Wow.
And he is, as I say, a saint. People recognize his sanctity. It's not an otherworldly kind of sanctity. He is he lives applied Christianity. There's a good example of once during his reign, there was a terrible famine that took place around the monastery itself, and the people were starving. And what Abbot Odilo did was he went in, and you know, the most precious things that the monks had were the sacred vessels that were used at Mass, the liturgical vessels. He melted down candlesticks and monstrances and all sorts of things and made gold ingots out of these, and then sold it in order to buy food for the people of the region.
Wow.
You know, it's just, well, they'll build them back up again someday,
Right.
but the people are irreplaceable.
Exactly. You have to have food.
And so by the time of his death, again, people had this tremendous, what a
Love
great
and
example.
respect. Uh-huh.
Yeah. He was succeeded by Hugh of Cluny. Again, huge longevity from 1050 to 1109.
Wow.
He also is a canonized saint.
Oh my gosh.
And, you know, when you think about it, St. Odilo had been abbot during the reign of Otto III, Henry II, who is also a saint. You know, the Emperor Henry II is also a canonized saint. Conrad II and Henry III. So he's the abbot and influences all of these emperors during this time. He's also abbot during the reign of 13 popes.
Oh my gosh.
So he's going to have tremendous influence. Otto the Third also is very much influenced when he becomes the king of Germany. Is very much influenced by all of these saints. You know, he's influenced in his taste by his mother, Theophano instilled, by his mother.
Okay.
But his taste in the way he dresses, he's very Greek. I mean, he's a German, but he's Greek and German. But he's very Greek in the way he runs his court. He loves to have Byzantine kind of things, and all of that. That's going to have so his taste is going to be Greek, but his faith is going to be influenced by grandma. Okay. By the way, I should mention that his grandmother, Adelaide, is among the German-speaking peoples a saint. She's known as Saint Adelaide. She was never canonized by the Roman Church, but she's one of those popularized saints. Right? Yeah, just simply acclaimed. Otto the
You
Third.
could see that.
Oh yeah.
I mean, for what she did.
Oh yeah, and also she was smart enough too to get really good tutors for little Otto, and one of those was a French intellect by the name of Gerbert of Aurillac. And I'll say some more things about him a little bit later on. He's really quite incredible. Gerbert of Aurillac had studied in monasteries, later went on down into Spain to study in Spain, picked up Hebrew, which is no easy thing.
No.
And studied with rabbis in Spain, some of the Spanish rabbis, and then picked up Arabic, which is no easy thing for sure, and was able to converse with imams. He was conversant with the Quran.
This is Otto the Third?
No. This is his tutor.
Gerbert
of Aurillac.
Okay.
Yeah, interested in science, in astronomy, in mathematics, lots of different things. And he comes back to France, and for various reasons had to get out of Dodge. That's another story we'll talk about later. But anyway, he goes over to Germany. Adelaide picks him up taps him as tutor, and then he becomes tutor of Otto III, and ultimately a lifelong companion, dear friend, and down the line he's going to become Pope.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, he'll be Pope Sylvester II, and you're going to have the combination of this incredible intellect and tutor of the emperor as Pope, along with the emperor himself. The combination is only going to last for a couple of years, but boy, I'll tell you what a powerhouse that was. As I say, and then the two of them will die within a year of each other in 1002, 1003. But for that brief period of time, you're going to have the alignment of stars that's just going to be quite tremendous. But we have to hold off. We have to hold off.
A little bit further down the road.
Yeah, a little bit further down the road. You're going to have, again, after the death of these two, again, Rome is going to be under the control of yet another Roman family. This is the Crescenzi family. For nearly 40 years, you're going to have weak popes that are going to be appointed by this family. One pope is going to be he's going to survive less than 1 year. Another is going to be there for 6 years, then for 3 years, another one for 12 years, 11 years, 12 years. One of those 12-year popes is actually going to be a pope 3 times.
Oh, yeah.
This is the famous Benedict IX. Yeah. And that is another story in and of itself. However, in the process, you will have another saint, which is going to have, they're going to be laying the foundation for the Great Reform. And this is Henry II. He was a Bavarian. His father was Duke Henry of Bavaria. He's Henry II of Bavaria.
Okay.
And his nickname is the Quarrelsome. So,
Henry or his father?
Okay, yeah, okay. This gets to be complicated. Okay. You got 2 Henrys here.
Yeah,
right?
1 and 2, right?
Okay. No.
Oh, no. Okay.
2 and 2.
Oh. Okay, that is more.
Let me see if I can explain this. So this is okay. So Henry of Bavaria is the second Duke of Bavaria called Henry. So he's Henry II of Bavaria.
Okay.
He has a son named Henry.
Okay.
Okay. If he had become Henry of Bavaria, he would be Henry III of Bavaria, right? But he doesn't become Duke of Bavaria, at least not for very long. He's elected the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire.
Okay.
But there's only one other Henry, Emperor.
Okay.
So he becomes Emperor Henry II.
Okay.
So here's how you have a father and son who are both Henry II.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
Eventually you get rid of all these monarchs and they come up with democracy. That's because it's so crazy. He has a mother also who is married to Henry the Quarrelsome, and she's this wonderful princess, again from Burgundy, Gisela, Princess Gisela of Burgundy, and she has a motherly influence on little Hank. Hank decides that his dad's in pretty good health, so he figures there's no sense in me worrying about the politics of Bavaria, and so he becomes an intellectual, and he begins reading and education, great love for his faith, very devout, and so he pretty much figures that that's what his life is going to be, and so what he does is he sets his life in that direction. All of a sudden, his dad died.
Oh, no.
In 993. He's 23 years old. And he becomes, complicated? He becomes Duke Henry III of Bavaria.
Okay.
Okay. He marries a wonderful woman who herself is a saint. She's got the unfortunate name of Cunegunda. But Saint Cunegunda married to Henry III. When Otto III died, Henry III of Bavaria is acclaimed the King of Germany, and therefore he leaves the title Henry III of Bavaria and becomes Henry II of Germany. He will use his authority all throughout Germany in order to bring about peace within Germany, and then also reformation within the church. He extends his authority from Germany into Italy, and it's during one of his trips to Italy that he lays the law down to those Roman families.
Okay.
And he then begins the cleaning up of the papacy itself. At that time, then he is crowned the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, establishes the Diocese of Bamberg in order to spread Christianity to the east. Even to there's a very wild part of Germany called the Vent, and is able to do that also. Ultimately, and we'll talk about his life a little bit later on, but ultimately he's going to be canonized, and this is not just a local canonization by the populace, but he will be canonized in the Roman Church. He's part of the hagiography. We celebrate the Feast of St. Henry every year, and he'll be remembered for his tremendous work in using his authority as emperor, using his authority in order to reform the church.
So he and his wife were both saints.
Yes.
That's pretty unusual. You don't see that too many times.
That's right. Yeah. So you have both Saint Henry and Saint Cunegunda, and then go back a generation earlier, the popularly acclaimed Saint Adelaide. So we're talking about the highest realm of German authority, and a bunch of saints.
Right.
And why? Because
Cluny.
Cluny.
Otto and what was the other one? The other.
Ed
Hergen, or
yeah,
what was his
yeah,
name?
Odo and Ottogen,
Yeah.
and what they did by leaving their monastery and going to Bohm and finding that little monastery there. That's why it's just so incredible. And St. Paul tells us this all the time, doesn't he? That God shines through our human weakness, and He makes us strong. It has to be through the. And I think that's one of the neat things about studying church history. If you are willing to open your eyes to the invisible, in a sense, not just the visible but the invisible, and to see these movements, any secular historian has to step back and go, whoa, I can't understand that. How could that happen? And they're left with the question, but it's only through the eyes of faith that you can
Absolutely.
see these incredible things happening through incredible little lives that bring about the health, again, of the church.
Definitely see the Holy Spirit working through it. That's the only way to survive some
There's
of what
no
they've
other
been
way
through.
to explain that. Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah.
Definitely. Wow, Father, this is wonderful. It is so good to be back.
Yes, it is.
Can we close today with a prayer and your blessing?
Glory be to the Father, to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
As it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.
May Almighty God bless you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Thank you, Father.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.